This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 100. Yeah, buddy.
Hey.
I really hope I didn't just wake the kids.
No, that would be trouble. Wouldn't be the first time.
I think that social emotional learning was like a game changer for us. It really changed the culture of the building. Kind of what we ended up doing is we were really reacting every day, and it was like this feeling of beating your head against the wall, because every day there would be a challenging behavior, and every day you would react to it, and it wasn't productive and it wasn't proactive, and so we.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action, because we are powering education by empowering you.
What's going on, everyone? This is your host of the Powered Up Podcast, Ken Ehrman, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt, the Century Man Rogers. Matt?
Yeah, buddy.
Well, yeah.
I'm like the 94 Man Rogers. I'll take that. How are you?
I really can't believe that we are in the hundreds. It's pretty crazy to think. I feel like we've been doing this for a while, but at the same time, I feel like we just started. But we launch every week. We only skip Thanksgiving now for the second year in a row, and that's definitely going to become a tradition.
Annual tradition.
Not launching on Thanksgiving, a reminder to teachers that you have to unplug and take a break. But so 51 shows a year, so we're here. It's pretty crazy.
Does that mean year 2 is up? That's pretty wild.
Yet.
I mean, close. We're basic math would tell you.
We launched in January.
Yeah.
So, but yeah. So most memorable. No, I won't go memorable. Most impactful experience from our 100 shows that you didn't anticipate.
I think just we've had some conversations that I feel like I'm very optimistic, don't get me wrong. Sometimes I play pessimistic and challenger to a lot of ideas, and I think that's the beauty, to open our perspectives through this podcast. I'm very optimistic, and I've become even more optimistic with the direction of education. We hear a lot about the challenges, and that is not it can't be overstated enough. Shortages and the challenges and those type of things, but there are some incredible educators across this country, and it doesn't matter if you're in a desirable location, in my opinion, or maybe a less desirable location. It doesn't change. We've interacted with just dynamite human beings all across the map, and they're just being so stubborn at being good educators, regardless of the limitations that they deal with. They are so focused on what is good for teaching. And, just I think we had a summer series this summer that I think was one of the best things that we've done across the podcast, where we invited some people back to have in-depth conversations that I felt like was when we talked about goals. We had a goal setting podcast that I remember, I think our 50th episode, where it was where we want to see the podcast go. And I feel like with that goal setting, we ended up, I prioritized getting below the surface scratch in education in these topics. And through our, traditional weekly guests, we've done it, but I was really appreciative of the summer series. And, hyper focusing on certain topics and really talking about the questions, the challenges, but also the next steps on topics that are really hard to talk about and really hard to define, but at least bridging and hopefully giving some inspiration of what that could look like and steps along the way to lead to success.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said. And for me, I think one of my original goals with the podcast was I knew there were a lot of great educators out there, and I wanted to find them and I wanted to talk to them and have them share their stories and pull out instructional strategies and things that I meaning the listener, I could apply to my own classroom. And we've absolutely done that with in my opinion, knocking that out of the park. The guests have just been unfreaking real. But I think to my pleasant surprise, there are so many amazing educators out there. And if we picture all of them as islands, I think there are way more islands than we realize, just because of the way anything in the world is covered. And so I really hope as we continue to do this and as we continue to grow and as our listeners continue to grow and share this with their colleagues and their friends in education, I really hope that we can become a powerful network that unites those islands and gets people to realize that someone down the hall, someone in the neighboring district, someone that they went to college with, someone somewhere is doing great things that they can collaborate with, both digitally, physically, however. So I really hope that we can continue to do what we've done and allow that network of islands to grow where we're not really islands anymore. And we owe that all to our guests. And tonight is no change in that whatsoever.
I totally agree. I just want to add, I feel like we sit on every week for about an hour and we feel the impact of these great educators. And I find comfort in knowing that, they go in every single day and get to, work with their staff or their communities. And so, that it's spreading beyond just that classroom for, of the 90 guests that we've had over 100 episodes. It's fascinating and really inspiring to see many of the same messages being carried out in very diverse and impressive ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, tonight is no change in that. Our guest, Norah Barney, is just fantastic. As we sat there and listened, she's been in leadership positions for a long time now. And I think educators will understand this. It was a very refreshing leader to talk to. Gets it, hasn't lost, as she said, her teacher heart. Just really understands what kids need, what teachers need. And it was just a really powerful, engaging and meaningful conversation. What was your biggest takeaway before we jump right in with her?
Yeah, I think that she knows her stuff. That's very evident, as most of our guests have, all of our guests have. But to kind of touch on your comment, I think it's really powerful to remember and recognize that someone that wants what you want as an educator is in the position to make it happen differently than you are. And I think that's really inspiring, and for her staff and who works with and for her, it's really great to know that hasn't been lost through the challenges of administration, because it makes it a really great leader to you want to do the best for her. And I would imagine her staff is just really grateful day in and day out for the opportunity and the chances they're afforded because of her being their leader.
Absolutely. So without any further delay, for all of our guests, for all of our listeners, thank you for listening, whether this is your first time or 100th time or somewhere in the middle. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and follow along as we continue to speak to, engage with, and find amazing educators across the country and across the world that are having a positive impact on education. So without any further delay, let's jump right in with Norah Barney.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
Hi, Norah. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing tonight?
I'm good.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to jump into this conversation with you. So kick things off real simple for us. Just officially introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming from and give us a snapshot of what your career in education has looked like.
So my name is Norah Barney, and I am currently a curriculum director and special ed director in Montana. Previously, I was a preschool through second grade principal in the same district that I'm currently in. And then before that, I was an assistant principal special ed teacher in Wyoming. I've done lots of jobs in special ed, self-contained, inclusive, things like that. So currently, trying to make some changes in special education through the guise of curriculum as well. So
very interesting. So what was one of your biggest reasons so you were in special ed, transitioned into being a principal servicing all students, and now moving back towards a position that has a lens of special ed. What was your driving force to make that leap back into special ed that you felt was your calling and need for it?
Well, I love special ed. When I went to undergrad school and graduate school, I didn't really want to be a special ed teacher. I just wanted a job. And I knew that I could get a job by majoring in special ed. But I fell in love with it through student teaching. I had students in my field experience class that just had magical moments that, gave you that warm, fuzzy feeling that we all seek when we're educators. And then when I became a leader, it was more about trying to help others with those magical moments and trying to help others kind of realize that all kids can learn. They're just learn maybe a little differently or a little slower. And so that's really why I wanted to become a building admin. And then jumping back in, it was, I needed a change. I had been a building admin for 9 years as the lead and then 4 years as an assistant. And I needed a change in my world. It was post-pandemic and I needed to fuel my fire a little bit more. So went back to what I knew best, which was special ed. So that's kind of why I went back to, I guess, the love. So
one of the things that I taught learning support, pretty much itinerant and, pull out nothing more significant than, supplemental type instruction levels. One of the things that I love is a conversation with regular ed teachers about what's best for kids. And from that perspective of it being a team approach, the IEP team all works together for the benefit of kids. A lot of times we wonder about how we could facilitate those conversations more productively. Because, when you're getting around for an IEP, a lot of times it's just, what is the decision's already made when you sit down at the table and present it, even though, the IEP is often in draft phase. We claim that it is, a draft and we might make a few adjustments. So I guess related to that and in your background, what are some of those ways that you feel like you best advocate for students, but also manage relationship with coworkers? Because that can be challenging to find the medium in between those two spectrums.
So in taking over this new role as the director of special ed, there was a lot of things that I didn't realize that my colleagues didn't know how to do. So as a leader of a building, I knew what needed to happen in special ed. I knew services that were required. I knew how to best facilitate learning and how to work with the interventions and how to, for lack of a better term, be a case manager for all the kids on IEPs within the building. And then, then as the leader, I was able to help, help the special ed teachers in working with their colleagues. But now that I'm in charge of other buildings, I realized that that's not actually the case in all the buildings in the district. And so that's been a really eye-opening experience for me of, realizing that a lot of administrators don't really have background in special ed. They don't understand, how to help all kids learn and how to make sure that they can stay in the classroom as long as possible. And they just need some tweaks to learning. So what we've been working on just recently has been, how do we help everybody be successful? And just this idea of ownership, like these are all our kids, and they're not just the special ed departments. They're not just mine. They're everyone's kids. And so, I had built that in my, my own school, but now I'm trying to build it as a district. And so that's really kind of been the biggest thing, is like helping everybody understand that these are everyone's kids, and they're, if they leave the classroom to go get intervention or support or whatever you want to call it in your district, that doesn't mean that it's not everyone's responsibility to help that student learn. And even if that student is nonverbal or, maybe struggling with learning a little bit more than the typical student, it doesn't mean that they can't learn and that we shouldn't celebrate their learning. So that's kind of been the biggest thing, because that was probably the hardest leap as a principal, was helping the general ed teachers realize that all these kids are ours. It doesn't matter what their label is. It doesn't matter, what their diagnosis is or what meds they're on. They're all our kids, and we just all work together to be a team to like do what needs to be done. So that's really what I'm trying to build at the district level right now, is that idea that they're all our kids. And if we all can agree that they're all our kids, then we can all do what we need to do. And so it's just about, I think for me, it's just been about listening to teachers and helping them have the support that they need, and then helping the special education teachers with supporting the general ed teachers so that they're a team instead of on an island. Because I think that's the model that isn't helpful.
I totally agree. And I just kind of want to follow up, and you could take this in a few directions. Your initial message is, they're all our kids. And I guess, what are some of those things that you feel like are either key things that you look for teachers to take away from that message? Like if they recognize, I have responsibility because this kid's in my room, I accept that, I want to be a part of learning. What are some of those things that either you wish as quickly as possible, like from your perspective, your teachers would acquire quickly, whether that's, develop skills to create better accommodations in class. So, it's maybe better identified, or what are some of those kind of little pillars that would help you achieve what your goals are to kind of build that team mentality within the district?
So I think one of it is, why does a student need to have a label to get help or to get something different? Like that's a big, like that's kind of the mindset of people that I want to work with, or that we want to hire, are people that, realize that if a kid needs a tweak to something, that there's not this invisible barrier that, well, they're not labeled. I can't help them. And it's like, well, why? Like, you can just do that. So I think that's really important. So that's probably the biggest one. And then the other thing would be realizing that not all kids need to fit in a box. So oftentimes we have, a teacher stands up, they deliver a lesson, and they fit into the teacher's box of, okay, I presented it, 95% of the kids in the classroom got it. And adjusting that box so that other kids can fit into it, that's a skill that I wish we had, because oftentimes that box won't mold itself around individual kids. It just is one box. I'm not changing it. This is how this is how we have to teach, and these kids could learn. And what I want more than anything is for people to realize that it's okay for you to adjust how you teach and what you expect, because everybody's different. And for some kids, the box is way over here, and maybe it looks like more of an oval than a square, but that I think just shows that there's a lot of flexibility needed. because that rigidity is legit. Like that is something that teachers need routine, and teachers need to know that they're successful. And if they have to adjust it, that is uncomfortable for some. And so, but knowing that if you adjust it, that everyone will be successful, and it's scary at first, but you'll be okay. That's, I think, the important thing for me. Those are like my top two things that I really feel like, just don't make kids fit into your box. Like just adjust your box and we'll be okay.
That's why you're the professional.
So,
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I would argue that box fits way less than 95% of students now more than ever. And
Right.
in support of what you're saying. Matt knows differentiation is on the top list. My top three of biggest passions as a teacher and a coach and a speaker. And also maybe not even transforming that box, but you need multiple boxes, or like you said, a box, an oval, a triangle. You need all of those prepared in your lesson, and you need to know what shapes your kids need as you prepare for that lesson. But I won't go in that soapbox just yet. I wanted to ask you, as you were talking about, your progression of your career, and now kind of your passions as a district leader and what you're hoping to accomplish. I feel like in education, a lot of times teachers we're our own worst enemies, in the fact that we don't build each other up. We don't support each other. We get frustrated, especially co-teaching is a scenario where it is like it's the greatest magical moment ever of harmony between those two co-teachers, or it can be absolutely terrible when they're not working together. And even if they're not doing traditional co-teaching, just that collaboration needed to support a student that has sometimes of pullout and sometimes of inclusion, or whatever the scenario is. When you moved into being a building leader, what were maybe one or two of your aha moments or surprises as you dove into regular education classrooms more, that you didn't necessarily think about as a special ed teacher? And then now moving back into the special ed realm, or even regardless, what do you think are misconceptions that a teacher like myself, who's never actually taught in a special education classroom, would possibly have some misconceptions about those classrooms that you think is important for teachers to be aware of?
So misconceptions. Well, I'll talk about surprises first. So, my first kind of dipping toes into leadership was this, amazing school in Wyoming. It was a blue ribbon school. It was high functioning. It had PLCs and grade levels and all the buzzwords. And this was, 13, 14 years ago. So they were doing things that at the time I knew nothing about. But it was a high functioning school. But there was very little challenging behavior at that school. They had a very supportive community. It was like your dream utopia school district, where the community was behind the schools. They were, state champions in basketball, volleyball. I mean, it was a great environment, but it wasn't a real depiction of what, I guess, for lack of a better term, the real world was like. I didn't know how I was going to react when a student would use profanity, because it never happened there. Never happened. And so when I moved home and I got this position as a elementary principal, one of the biggest surprises I had was first day of school, brand new day. Like I'm thinking we got a honeymoon, it's going to be a great day. And first day of school, there's a kindergartner on the playground kicking another student, in the stomach and swearing at them using profanity that no 5-year-old should ever use. And for me, that was culture shock. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't ready for the amount of students that in my community were diagnosed with oppositional defiance. I wasn't prepared for the lack of skill level that I didn't have, as well as the staff, to deal with that type of behavior. Also, I was a leader of a preschool through, second grade building. So we're talking 3-year-olds to 8-year-olds. And, kids were on lithium and risperidol and Lexapro and, all these really heavy antipsychotic drugs, which I was not prepared for. That wasn't, what I had experienced previously. And so that was, again, a culture shock. And I think that, one of the things that, the teachers and I think the community really taught me was that, at that time, and it took me a while to figure it out, but we didn't really have enough skills in our toolbox to deal with that. And so, I mean, nobody did. We were reacting. Every day it was a reaction. It was a classroom gets destroyed. Let's react to that. It was a teacher, being hit, and let's react to that. And it was like every day, let's hope that something doesn't happen that we have to react to. So it took a while to get in front of that and really create a system that was, proactive and really trying to set up environments that were preventative for students. I mean, we have students, of course, on medication because that's how, it works. But I don't think that there's a single student in that school right now that's on lithium or risperidol, on those really heavy, those antipsychotic meds that no little one should ever be on. But, that's not for me to decide for sure. So, I mean, for me, that was huge for me. Like the behaviors were really challenging. And then, I really thought I had the skills to deal with it. Hey, I'm a special ed teacher. Like I can write behavior plans and I can, help students and teachers, and it's all about relationships. And that was really difficult because I did not have the skills necessary to work with the students or the staff. Like, so I had to become a learner, and I had to learn, how to create a culture and how to, change a culture that, had just been reacting to these challenges. So I think that was a big thing. Because that, I mean, literally like the first couple years of coming back, the challenging behavior just engulfed your day. You got nothing else done. There was no going into classrooms and being an instructional leader. There was no, thinking about test scores. It was literally reacting to challenging behaviors and hoping that the teachers were safe and the kids were safe and, that the environment was a positive one. So I think those were really big. And then I think the other thing would be, kind of a misconception that I think general ed teachers have regarding special educators is that I think some people think that special education teachers just do puzzles or color or do art projects all day. And I know that that's a really old and like antiquated way of thinking of it, but I still think it's there. Because that's sometimes what happens, right? Like, when kids are, they leave the classroom, they go someplace else, the teacher doesn't know what happens. And so they go someplace and maybe they do puzzles or maybe they, are doing coloring and it's just, they're not in the general teacher's classroom anymore. And so it's, I'm going to wipe my hands and we're good. But I think that the reality is that if you have a culture in your school that is very open and it provides an opportunity for the teachers to go and watch each other. I'm sure you guys in your schools, that's probably what happens for you guys as teachers go and watch each other for that professional learning. I think that if you have that culture set up where teachers are learning from each other, then it becomes a really eye-opening experience to be like, oh, I didn't know you did that in your room. I'm going to do that in my room now. Thanks for sharing that with me. And they even will say things like, oh, that was really helpful. I didn't realize that you use this instructional routine to teach these sounds or, whatever it happens to be. So I think that misconception is, I think it's still there. I think it's still a part of just pre-service, I'm not going to touch special ed, but I'm going to learn how to differentiate, for lack of a better term, and hope that like someone else at my school when I get hired will take over. So I think that's part of it, but I don't know. I think that's just part of the misconception of what special ed is. And I think it, depending on what school you're in, that's what it is. So, and really, let's be honest, there's a huge shortage of special ed teachers. So,
Absolutely. Matt, I want to just throw that at you real quick. When you transitioned from special ed to regular ed instructionally, what was a shocker for you that you didn't expect as a former special ed teacher that was challenging in a regular ed classroom?
The behaviors. The sheer amount of like challenging stuff for me. I guess that was for Matt, but what was
Yeah,
Matt's
so I mean, I
thing?
think the shift when I made that change, I found, I essentially was doing the same thing I did in special ed. When I was designated as the person, when I got a class roster that, was no longer a caseload, but instead, it was 18 kids instead of 12, or, 25 kids instead of, 15. I just realized that, unfortunately, in my head, I thought, okay, life's going to be easier. Realistically, I have to now take that window of what I'm providing support for and expand it. And I think it was fascinating for me. My responsibility and my motivation of moving to regular ed was I didn't feel like I was seeing results in kids in their reading development. Like, I could tell myself that I naturally wasn't as good of a reading instructor in finding creative ways. Because that's the thing, like, Nora, what you're kind of talking about is special ed teachers. And I would highly suggest, if you have a special ed teacher that has been in the classroom more than 3 years, and I don't mean that rude to anyone new, but there is something special about a special ed teacher that has stuck it out past 2 burnout periods. If they are, there for 8, 9+ years, they are probably, whether they will boast about it or not, the best teacher in your building. It is without question, because they are so resourceful to find results in a position where often you could so focus on the negative or the challenges. So I'm just saying that if you have the opportunity, if you have someone in your building, they are probably not going to boast about how great they are. You need to absorb as much as you can from an experienced special ed teacher. My entire classroom was completely adjusted because I, invested time with my autistic support classroom. Because, Nora, I'm sure you had this conversation plenty of times. I struggle with STIs personally. When I look at a list of STIs, they look like, good teaching practices that I probably should do for all kids. So what do I try to do? Provide them for all kids. There's obviously specific ones, but what I found is these teachers with repetition and opportunity to actually see growth, when if you're not super trained in that realm, you're going to get frustrated. That's the hard part about special ed. If you don't invest the time to find differentiation that actually works, you're going to not have the satisfaction that you set out for in education. And so that's where that, distinction, that was a really hard realization. And when I moved to regular ed, it was, I have to now do that plus extension. Oof, that was a rough one. I had to do that plus manage behaviors. Oof, that's a rough one. I had to do that plus, deal with double the number of parents because, naturally, you're in charge of all of the features, not just the IEP and the, reading and writing and math instruction. So I don't know. That's kind of rambling. That's, a little bit of my pedestal, but I think the hard thing that I found additionally related to that is, I went into that position and I still try to make it true that my goal is to not have kids identified for special ed. Now, what I mean by that is if a kid needs a service, I'm not obviously barring them from that. But every time I see any of my special ed teachers, I'm asking them, how can I keep that kid more frequently in my day? It's not that I don't think it's beneficial, but it's my responsibility to, like you're saying, adjust my classroom to be the most conducive to their benefit of instruction possible. And there are limitations there, right? And those limitations are not just occupational therapy. They're not just, behavior-based, but there is a way that you can create 80% of support in a regular ed environment and remove a lot of the reason why kids are leaving and that time of instruction is increasing so much. So I'm not saying I'm doing it well, but that's at least my intention, going into each day.
How, as you've as you progress through your career as a building leader and now as a district administrator, how has the topic and the ideas of social and emotional learning leaked into practices that you're encouraging or that you're supporting your teachers in using, or how has it brought light to things that you were already doing, but now there's an acronym tied to it?
I think that social emotional learning was like a game changer for us. It really changed the culture of the building. Um, kind of what we ended up doing is we were really reacting every day, and it was like this feeling of beating your head against the wall, because every day there would be a challenging behavior, and every day you would react to it. And it wasn't productive and it wasn't proactive, and so we need to get on the same page with language. We need to get on the same page with how we have universal supports in the classrooms with picture schedules or visual supports. And each teacher was doing amazing things, but none of them were a cohesive building. And so we really needed to kind of get to a place where we had that. And really, when we started to treat social emotional learning just like reading and math. So, when we said, okay, listen, we find time to treat students that need reading intervention and math intervention. We find time in our day to make sure that they get it, that all teachers in the school do reading intervention. And so why can't we find the time to do this for behavior? Like, we would find it if it was for reading, and really having that conversation as a staff was really powerful, because the answer was, well, yeah, of course we're going to find it. Let's find it. And so then we would, and we'd adjust schedules. But I think for me, like, social emotional learning was a huge culture shift for us. Like, really learning about it, learning about the skills that kids had. And we were a school that, and I'm a big proponent of numbers. Like, you have to have a number to decide whether or not what you're doing is working, right? So you have to have a Dibble score, you have to have a Moby Max number, you have to have a number that tells you whether or not you're being effective, quantifiable way. And we went that direction because we needed to have a way to say what we're doing is working. We always had groups for kids with challenging behaviors. We always had the counselor take the kids that struggled at recess, right? Or we had the special ed teachers service the kids who had those services on their IEPs, but we never really had a way to say, okay, these kids in our school have this social emotional competency. And so we moved in that direction. We started using DESA and EDECA for our assessments, which really helped us, get a quantifiable way. But really, it wasn't about that tool that really gave us that number. It was about the culture change that happened, where it was like, we're saying that behavior is communication. We're saying that, as adults, we need to work on our own social emotional learning, because we struggle with those things as well, and it's okay to admit it, and our kids do as well. And so we're going to focus on our social emotional health at the same time as our students. And I think, honestly, I keep saying this, but it really was a culture shift for us, like really figuring out how as a school we were going to treat behavior was a night and day experience. And going back to how we did that, I think I wouldn't change it. I think we had to go through the bumps and bruises of reacting to behavior and then realizing, okay, this isn't working. Let's figure out what we should do differently. And then I think as a school district, we're also moving in that direction as a school district. So our school district has adopted curriculums and with the hope and the guise of getting that common language, but we kind of pushed it because we were the preschool through second grade, right? So that they started with us with that language and that common, approach to how we dealt with challenging behavior. And so that's what we're kind of pushing district wide, is also trying to, help the teachers and the students realize that yes, you can do this, and it's appropriate at all levels, even at the high school. So even the high school now is doing social emotional lessons and trying to get that common language, that's difficult in the high school, to really get secondary teachers to step away from the content and really work through social emotional has been a really big shift, which I think has been positive. I don't know. In your guys' schools, do you guys do social emotional learning focus as well?
Ken, I'll let you speak, and then no, I mean, did you probably did stuff before you left the classroom, I would imagine.
So yeah, it was actually a district initiative from our superintendent who joined our district. I want to say 2016. In terms of just putting it on everybody's radar, I'm pretty sure it was like part of her dissertation at one point. But coming up with systems that were appropriate for elementary, middle school, and high school. Simple things like an acronym that was used district wide. At the same time, we had rolled out a behavior system in our elementary school focused around social emotional learning, and I was part of that committee. And the thing that I enjoyed about that is we really looked at what were systematic ways to encourage positive behavior that would encourage positive emotions in students that work towards both success academically as well as success in life. So our acronym was around the word proud. And it was being proactive, raising the bar, being optimistic, being united, and being determined. And under those five key letters, we had like specific things that they could do that you could point to in a gym class, in an art class, in a regular ed, special ed classroom, on the recess yard, in the cafeteria. And it still is in place today. And we rolled that out, I want to say in like 2015. And it really did transform the culture of the school. That was already a very good school, mostly, students that are coming from backgrounds that support education, that type of stuff. But it really brought the whole child to light. And I had a parent talk to me about it at one point. And the thing that I remember from that conversation was they appreciated that the principles were not controversial in any way, especially now. It would still hold true just with everything that's going on in our society. But it was simple things that they could support at home, and also that they felt simple principles that you teach your children at home were also being supported in school. And it was something that every teacher could latch onto, and every teacher could twist what being proactive means in their own classroom and encouraging those behaviors. And it was something that students learned in kindergarten and were enforced throughout fifth grade when they left the elementary school. Big award assemblies, like it was an all-out effort. And one of the coolest things for me was we created so they could earn Pauls and things for those letters. When they were in fifth grade, we gave a proactive award to one student, or raise the bar up, one for each letter. And when we rolled it out, we tried to make it a big deal. They get a big plaque. There's a placard in the main hallway that records their names. Come year like 5 or 6 of this, it is a insanely big deal. The fifth graders are all amped to see who's going to win. The whole school is amped because they've seen it from first grade. So they see these kids on stage being recognized for being the most optimistic person out there. So you don't have to have the best grades. You don't have to have, the highest achieving scores. It has nothing to do with that. It's everything to do with who you are as a person and how you carry yourself as a person. And it really just had and has such a profound impact on that school and those students and the teachers. And so that was a big thing that every teacher carried into their classroom. And like I said, really made those words work for the way we carry our own classroom.
The only thing I would add, so we have, positive behavior intervention support, PBIS, which is, very much in line, Ken, with what you're saying. And I found myself as, I would say 2018, 2019, the vice grip of standards and testing was really starting to become very consuming. And honestly, I probably shouldn't say this out loud. The best thing, at least in my educational journey, was COVID. The idea of, obviously, virtual learning, not great. Want to be back. I'm not being honest when I say that, but I remember coming out of that is it gave me clearance in my classroom to do what I felt like was best for kids again. And I didn't have to be so tied to, priorities that I didn't completely believe in. I think we did, and you go to a conference and everyone continues to say relationships are what matters, and you build those relationships. Norah, you've said it. Ken, we've said it, probably 100 times for 100 episode, right? Like, we say that it's important, but just like you said, walking that situation, unless you've put that to test, you may not actually know what that means or the depth of how real you need to develop those relationships. Norah, at that first school that, is Pleasantville, USA, the depth of your relationships didn't need to necessarily be anything crazy, right? Like, it didn't need to. And so you're thinking, man, I've got it going. And you go to a place that actually tests you. And boy, oh boy, that's where you have to reevaluate. And I'm sure, knowing who you are very briefly, you figured it out pretty quickly. And I think that's where, Ken, it gave us excuses and kind of lowered the expectations on not just the anxiety in kids pre-pandemic was unbelievable. It was coming to this boiling over point. And so I am grateful for the SEL component of my building and how it became something that everyone didn't think was, oh, that's a nice idea, that's fun, but I can't find time for it, and became something we prioritized, not in a specific classroom, not in a grade level, but in a building. And I would hope universally SEL is known by all teachers at this point, and also valued by all teachers, because it needed to be, to get back to whatever normalcy that we have right now. So with that being kind of said, Norah, you mentioned that transition into, a more real world teaching environment as you were an administrator of a place that, provided some challenges for you. What are some of the things that you felt like you instituted into that building that led to shifts? And you mentioned you started to see shifts of being, instead of reactive, leading to being proactive. Or, what are some of those things that you felt like you started instituting that actually you started to see a change to, almost getting your placement there to look closer to Pleasantville, USA, teachers on board, there's morale, those type things. What were some of those things, those victories? And please don't be bashful, give yourself credit for hard work I'm sure you put in.
I feel like it was just a process of, starting to have team meetings and calling them grade levels and sitting around the room and talking about data, and teachers being uncomfortable about, what does the data mean? And am I going to get judged? Is this a safe place to be vulnerable? And also hearing comments about, excuses, for lack of a better term, as to why kids weren't learning. Things like, kids are lazy and things like that. So the conversations that we started with were a lot different than the conversations we ended with. And so kind of just knowing that that's where we were at, and then kind of getting to this point where it was like, okay, you can't really say that a student is lazy anymore, because, they're just not lazy. They're not coming to school to, ruin your day or whatever. They just don't have the skill, and it's okay to say that out loud. Like, we're not judging the number. We're here to help you and support you. And so I think as a leader, like, I had to be comfortable saying those things in a nice, tactful way, so that the staff felt safe to be vulnerable in those meetings, so that they could get help from their colleagues and not feel that they were going to get judged or evaluated or lose their job, that it was a safe place. And so the biggest thing was like helping the staff feel vulnerable, and knowing that there were people that would help them, and that they could come to me and that I would help them. And if I didn't know the answer, I'd figure it out, and we would try it together, and I'd model things. And if it didn't work, it didn't work. And we laughed and we tried again, and I think that just creating this environment that people didn't feel that their jobs were on the line, I think was a huge shift for us. And then, over time, we kind of got to this point where, just like I said before, the data and having a quantifiable way to determine whether or not what we're doing was working was probably the most powerful change that we made. and understanding the data and taking the journey together as learners was really powerful. Like, I sat in those meetings and I sat in the PD and I asked questions, and I would challenge the presenters, or I would challenge the, people who were presenting content, not because I didn't agree, but because I wanted to learn. And so I think, again, modeling the thinking and modeling the learning was valuable and important. So I think that was huge. I think that the teachers in general there really understood that I was more of a learner with them, and that I would help them. But there were definitely non-negotiables for me as a leader, that I got to a point where, if as a school we agreed that we would do X, Y, and Z, and you were having a behavior in your classroom or your data wasn't improving, it was sort of like, I'll go on a model for you and I'll help you and I will give you all the support that you need. But if you're not going to be vulnerable with me and take the journey with me, I'm not sure that this is the right place for you. And so I think that was really powerful. But also, I think we've all worked in schools where, or have had positions where you just know like what is okay and what's not okay. Like, and this sounds silly, but like that school that I was in Wyoming, this Utopia school, like, you knew that when you walked into that school, it was a school where you were learning. Like, announcements didn't happen. Assemblies, we didn't take time to do that. Teaching and learning were like really valuable for us. We were a small school. We couldn't, take time to do those things. And yes, we would do them, but it wasn't like once a week or once a month that we would do those things. But they occurred. You'd have your quarterly celebrations and things like that, but it wasn't part of the culture of that school to do that. And so I think for me, like, the hope that I wanted was that when you walk through the doors of that school, you knew what was okay and what wasn't. Like, we didn't interrupt instruction for announcements. We Parents knew that if you needed to deliver a message, then you deliver it, using our communication app. We use Seesaw. That's how they needed to do it. It wasn't going to be, we were going to call the classroom and interrupt class. And if it was for transportation, the teachers will check their messages right before the end of the day, but don't expect a response before, this time. So I think that was it. Just really just setting that line, and then just making sure that everybody understood that that's how we did business. I just think that that's the most important part about any change that you make, is making sure that there's support, you model it, and that you're making sure that you're learning right along with everybody else, and just supporting, I guess. I think it's just all about the culture, really.
I want to ask a follow up to that. You kind of addressed it, so maybe just to see if you have anything to add. So in general, you've talked about shifting the culture of the schools or the school district that you're working with multiple times, which I think is great. What advice do you have for, let's say, a building leader that wants to shift the culture of something? Doesn't really matter what it is, but there's a culture, there's some sort of culture that exists, and that the principal wants to shift that culture. What advice do you have for them to kind of systematically approach that, break it down, reestablish a new one? And then to challenge you a little bit, could you provide advice, maybe it's similar, maybe it's different, to a teacher that wants to establish a culture in their own classroom that is not normal in the school? Does that make sense?
Yes. All right, let me see. Okay, so I think for any leader who's trying to change something, the most important thing to do is to really learn about where you're at. So we are all very comfortable in a certain type of environment where we came from, and going to a new environment is uncomfortable. And it's amazing, because when you're uncomfortable, you grow, but it's really uncomfortable. And so I think for any leader, they really just need to like sit back and take it in, like definitely learn, like, the school's standing, it's functioning. There are things that are really good in every building that you walk into. And it doesn't matter if it's the way that you did things previously, but just like take a breath and learn. Like, take a breath and learn from the teachers, talk to the teachers, build those relationships with the teachers, have those conversations. And really in order to do any change, you have to have a relationship. So there's no way to go in year one and be like, all right, we're changing the schedule. We're going to, add this class and, do X, Y, and Z when the staff is used to doing things a certain way. They won't survive. So really it's about observing, seeing how business is done, taking notes, and really the first year, get those relationships in order. Like you need to spend some time really learning and complimenting and finding all the good that staff do, because we tend to, when you take on new roles, and I've had to remind myself a lot of this year because I have a new role, is that you really need to find the positives. So there are things that will drive you nuts as a leader. There are things that you will not like, but take those glasses off and have this guise of positive intent and really find all the amazing things that are happening in that school. And then as you start to think through the changes that you want to make, just remember that change takes time. Like I was in that school for 9 years, and it took me 9 years to get it where I needed it to be. And it doesn't happen overnight, and you have to build your team and you have to build systems, and it takes time, and it's frustrating, and you want it to happen right away, but it's not going to happen. And if you push it, you won't survive. Number one, relationships. Like if you want staff to walk through walls for you, they have to trust you. And I guess I always viewed myself as a leader as someone who says yes to everything and removes walls. So if you are struggling with something in your classroom and you need something for it, I need to find the money to make sure you get it. So I say yes, and I remove barriers so that you can teach and the kids can learn. Like that's my job as a leader. And so I wanted to always model that for my staff. And so getting that relationship was really important, because if I ever needed to ask them to do something that was going to be uncomfortable, at least they knew that I had their back for other things and it was going to be okay. But there's no way, just take your time. I think that would be the biggest advice. Just take your time and sit back and learn where you're at and learn about the amazing things, and then make some small adjustments here and there. That would be the biggest thing.
Can I just
and
pop
then
in?
For teachers,
Just real quick,
yeah.
I feel like we've heard it on the podcast. I can't remember. You might be able to, before Norah, you talk about the teacher end of things. The idea of, a good administrator takes years to make an impact that's positive, unfortunately, but a bad leader takes an instant to change the morale of a school. And I think that's the uphill battle that, a lot of times, administrative jobs are very challenging. And a lot of times, because of not an intention to not do well, but just the overwhelming nature of being an administrator, it's a really challenging thing to walk into that position and recognize what you're walking in, trying to recognize what are the situations before you can start addressing, the order of how to address them. And so, as you mentioned, it took 9 years to get to the point where you wanted to. That's a quarter of your career. That's astonishing. But, that's where, as you mentioned, finding that positive so that in year 2 or a half a year in, you're still satisfied with, it's not quite where I want it to be, but boy, oh boy, we're taking those steps and those leaps. And unfortunately, I'm sure you'll be able to reinforce it is not a linear growth either, which makes it even more discouraging.
Well, and someone made an analogy about being a leader, and it was one of my superintendents, and he said, listen, you want to become a state championship basketball team, and I get it, but how about you just work on making a layup? Like, how about this year it's just about making a layup, and next year it's about a full course press or something. And so, like that type of analogy was really helpful, because, sometimes you do walk into a building and you're like, okay, we're going to be state champions and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And the staff is like, no.
Yeah. So please go ahead. I think the beautiful, and I would love to hear your answer. Ken and I we're both educators that, didn't necessarily go along the grain in the classroom. So when you feel like you're doing things that are good for kids and, trying and as you're mentioning, modeling what you think is good creative thinking and these type of things, how can a teacher continue to feel encouraged, even if it's not the, typical way that a classroom, or maybe, the experienced teacher next door wouldn't teach it that way and isn't as encouraging.
So you mean just with having a new leader?
Well, I'm just kind of using Ken's question and just saying, like, in that realm of taking that same question but applying it to the teacher as opposed to the administrator.
Right. How as a teacher do you feel you can establish a culture in your classroom that is very different from what your colleagues do, especially, let's say a K through 5 school, or even we'll say a K through 5, and you're like in the 4th, 5th grade, where this is going to be way different than what kids have experienced. Or as a high school teacher, my single classroom in the schedule of a student's day is going to be very different than what my colleagues do. How do you establish that culture as the teacher?
Yeah, and so we use this acronym or mantra, and it comes from conscious discipline, but it does ring true. It's like this idea of a classroom family, and so creating this culture within your within your building, and also within your classroom, I think is just as important. We use that verbiage because it worked within the guise of what we were doing, but I didn't really understand it until later of what really that meant. And what it really means is that you're creating this environment where, kids feel safe and they feel vulnerable and they know that you're their person and that you're connecting with them. And so I guess the advice I give to teachers is it's okay to take time to build those relationships. If you're struggling with some challenging behavior or something that's happening, like take the time to build the relationship, because you're not going to get anywhere anyways with the content. And so making sure, and I would tell my staff that all the time, like, I think you need 3 days, let's just really like take a break and let's really build some connections. Let's really have students talk about what bothers them. So let's do a lesson on it bugs me when this happens, and really have the freedom to do that. And if you give teachers, as a leader, if you give teachers that time and the freedom to do that, teachers love it. Because yes, there's this pressure of test scores and standardized testing and making sure that things are done, but you still can't do all that unless you have this family within your world. And so it's making sure that it's safe. So making sure that if students are struggling, that we help them through it. If they're gone, we welcome them back. If we stand outside the door and we greet, and it's not just silly handshakes, it's really greeting, eye contact, and really fist bumps, high five, and all that, but also really knowing what happens with the kid on the weekend, or understanding their situation at home, and having that freedom to have those conversations. Because I think sometimes teachers really feel, and I think that this is just part of the job, is that they feel like, I don't have time to do that. I need to get all these things done. I got to get through my book. I got to get through my curriculum. But really, if you don't take the time to do that, you're never going to build a family within your building or your school. So personally, I think that's the most important thing you do. Yes, routines and procedures are important. Yes, making sure that you have engagement within your lessons. But the number one thing you need to do is you need to make sure that your students understand that you're their person, and that the students understand that they can have connections with each other and connections with their teacher, but also that it's safe, and that someone's going to be there to help them if something happens. So I think those are like really important things for me. Like for me, that's more important than any curriculum that I buy off the shelf or any strategy that I'm having the teachers do. It's really taking the time to really really get to know your kids and build those relationships. I think that's important. And I think just being authentic about it, because like when we interview teachers, we ask, okay, so how do you build relationships with kids? And everybody, well, I have them fill out a questionnaire, like, all those things. And we've all done that, and we've all done the questionnaire thing, but that's not really building a relationship with your students. And so I think teaching teachers how to do that and giving them the freedom to do it and do it properly, I think, is the most important thing.
So you're saying interest surveys don't help you know exactly about
Oh, they're great.
So I
think interests are
they are,
great.
you know,
However,
it's not the end all be all.
That's the only thing
I'm listening to
Yeah.
you think or say, and I'm just thinking, not that I'm, you know, trying to validate my COVID being a great thing by any means, but I'm fascinated by what you're saying, and I'm wondering, how would Norah, starting in that principal role, respond to how you just talked about the priorities of education 9 years ago? Do you think it would be very much in line,
No, hard
or
pass.
like how would it look differently? How
No.
has education really changed, and you know, in what ways is that necessarily for the better and possibly for the worse?
Well, I think Norah of 9 years ago came from this wonderful.
So why don't we do
utopian
eight and a
school
half years ago? You know, you're in control of this environment, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that I think that the Nora of 8.5 years ago would have had a really hard time with what I just said of like, okay, you need to press pause and build relationships, because at the time I didn't realize the importance of social emotional learning, and I didn't realize the importance of structures and culture and in all the things that we built over time. And so I would have had a hard time with that. I learned a lot, and I think that's why I needed a change as well. But because we had built something that I think will sustain leadership and changes that have been made. But I think in COVID, the one thing about COVID that I don't know if you guys experienced this too, but when the kids came back, there was like a developmental difference between where they left and where they came back in terms of social emotional skills. Like, right. Like, so you would have kids in second grade that could identify their emotions and tell you, what they were feeling and why they were feeling it. But then they came back from COVID and that wasn't there, because they were the kindergartners, right? They left in kindergarten and didn't come back, some of them, until second grade. So, I think that was, I don't know if you guys had that too, but I think COVID changed a lot of developmental continuum for social emotional competence. Honestly,
I think just to contribute to that, I mean, I feel like I value what second grade, having what would have been first and second graders at that time. I recognize, how they really instruct kids to do school, because things that I expect them to be able to handle in fourth grade is a challenge. And developmentally, like what you're talking about, I'm not here to make excuses. That's not what I'm trying to do, but it's astonishing. And I have gained a ton of respect to kind of what you were saying almost earlier of what we, misconception of special ed is you're doing puzzles and, light, fluffy stuff, keeping them out of my hair type activities. In reality, those second, first grade teachers are teaching learners how to do school and build stamina and, those foundational skills, so I can turn my attention to real teaching, which I think, brings up a really good point. I have a big question, and I hope that you're okay with me asking this. And, sometimes on this podcast, I ask these questions, they make total sense in my head, and they don't in reality. So can spin through this a lot. I'll use the idea of educational paradigm shifts in general. You have a pretty wide base of understanding, how education's gone. You've researched, from your experience in school to the many positions that you've been in. Continuing with this idea of SEL, where do you feel like we grow and continue to improve? Whether that's, I'm not necessarily asking for the next buzzword, like, hey, this is going to be the new version of SEL or STEM or, differentiated learning, but where do we head as an educational group that we prioritize what's good for kids? Because I think as you're gathering those thoughts, like, we as special ed teachers saw a time where, pull out was really prevalent and great, and it was an opportunity to provide a ton of support directly, but it was isolating and maybe not great for social skills or labels, as you're mentioning. And then we also in our career saw push in and co-teaching and all these different things, and realized that intensive instruction wasn't helping in that paradigm shift, and inclusion. And we're starting, at least from the special ed lens to pull back to, and take a sprinkle of both, but pull back towards pull out more exclusively. So I use that as an example. You don't have to look from the lens of special ed, but what I mean by that is, we're heading in a direction in education that we have to start setting goals for ourselves, and we need to keep ourselves open-minded and really look towards how do we continue to do best by kids, and just using your expertise, where do you think that will lead us in the next few years?
I think social emotional learning is going to be here for a bit. I know that there's always that, the continuum and shifting, that you talked about with special ed, but I think social emotional learning is going to be here for a while. I think the effects of COVID are going to continue to be here for a while. Like just as an example, in kindergarten, we do speech and language screenings. And so 100 kindergartners, right? 45 of them flagged as needing full evaluations. And so these are kids that were 2-3 years old at home with masks, or were around people that were with masks. And so, I think that speaks a lot to the effects of COVID and how that's going to affect our world, just that little piece, right? So that's speech and language. That's not learning about emotions. That's not learning how to identify emotions or to regulate our behaviors. But that speaks to that developmental continuum. And I do think that what's going to happen is that social emotional learning will be a priority. Like it has to be. Because if not, we're not going to be able to teach. And so I think it's not only the social emotional learning for kids, but I think this idea, and it's sort of started, but this idea that social emotional learning for adults. So it's like, teaching the staff what's their missing skill or what's their competency in social emotional that they don't necessarily have. Like maybe it's, not being able to set goals or realizing that, social awareness, things like that. I think that that's going to be a huge part of our world. I think that's going to be the shift. I think it's starting, and in some places that, social emotional learning is not viewed as a good acronym. People aren't a fan of it, but it's there. Whether you call it, whole child competencies, or you call it something else, it's still social emotional learning. It just might not be called SEL. So I think that it's going to play a big role in our world. I mean, there's a ton of grants out there for mental health. There's a ton of grants out there to implement social emotional learning within your classroom, because people have seen the effects that COVID have had on mental health. And the social emotional learning is tied to that. And it's a huge indicator for, future success and things like that. So I do think that it's going to be there for a while. Just like reading, the push for reading for all those years with Reading First grants and things like that. I think that will be a huge part of our lives. What do you guys think?
Ken, do you have any insight?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think I think people get hung up on the acronyms and those types of pieces. I think it's coming in swing with the pushback on standardized testing and the how valuable is this one measure. I think it's going to kind of ride that swing as well as we move towards that. You have teaching the soft skills or the 4 C's, and I'm hopeful that all of that is going to kind of ride together, because I've always advocated for the need. Standardized testing can be there or not. It never impacted the way I carried my classroom, but just this idea of getting the students to be much more active in the classroom and having more active roles in the way a classroom functions instructionally. And so if you want to encourage those social emotional pieces and those soft skills of communication and collaboration, all of that falls together instructionally when students are driving the classroom more, and there's less direct teaching to a classroom of 30 kids at once. So I'm hopeful that kind of all of that rides together, and it's not going anywhere, and it really transforms the way education looks, both emotionally and instructionally.
All right, so I'll pop in, and it's kind of a merge of what you both were saying. I think there's a a consumer aspect to education, unfortunately, today with, the idea of kids have gone through digital learning. And if, your local public elementary school is not cutting it for you, there are good alternative options. And that is a hard part. And so with that being the case, I also think that, there are good educators. There are great educators that are debating their fate in education. So my maybe optimistic goal for education is that it becomes a place that prioritizes what matters most. And that looks like using standards as guidelines, but not necessarily assessment items. I have no problem with normed assessments to see how my kids are doing. I just don't necessarily care that much about the evaluation. And me taking away a care about how that, translates to my end of year kind of report has freed me up to make my classroom a space that meets what you were saying, both of you. Relationships matter. I'm making priorities of relationships. My co-teachers, my grade level mates are 5, 6, 7, 10 lessons ahead of me. I don't care. I don't care whatsoever. I feel no pressure because my kids, when I ask them to take the test that, is important, they show up and they work their tail off. And I think that as we de-emphasize, that's my goal, de-emphasize and increase this social emotional learning, we remember that things like project-based learning and, really my ultimate goal is teachers seeing their own excellences and being welcome to bring that into the classroom. Whatever your passion is, Ken's passions are different than mine, but recognizing he's a great teacher too is an important thing, while also not recognizing that doesn't make me not, because my classroom doesn't look like his, that we can have our own teaching styles, just like kids can have their own learning styles, and that be embraced to enhance is my ultimate goal. Again, optimistic view, but I think that, as teachers are leaving, as students potentially are, having options, and when we're all recognizing that for years we've kind of said, the same old isn't good enough, that we can kind of act on it being good enough finally. So that's just not to get too, fired up towards, we've stolen you too long already, but, I'm sure we can continue that conversation. But Ken, I know we're probably in time for the exit ticket at this point.
Yeah, I don't want to end this conversation, but I do want to be cognizant and respectful of your time. So the exit ticket is the same 4 questions we ask every guest every week. So I'll jump right in with question number 1. What is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
I think the best thing that a teacher can do is, again, relationships, but I think also just making sure that learning is fun, right? So that, every day there's routine, but making sure that it's fun, like making sure that it's engaging, making sure that they get to talk to their friends and they get to engage with things. And also, the biggest thing I think is being able to share it in real time with their parents. So COVID, right? COVID made us be virtual teachers, and we adopted whatever platform was readily available at the time because we were all scrambling, and we use one that the parents can see exactly what kids do and they can comment on their stuff right away, and they love it and it's amazing. So that's the best thing. Keep parents engaged, keep kids engaged. Engagement.
That transparency is huge. You gave us a tidbit from your superintendent talking about winning a state championship basketball starts with a layup, but thinking about, best piece of advice that you've received in your career, and it could be from a colleague, a supervisor, or even a student.
Best piece of advice I got was from a principal in Wyoming. He's currently the superintendent of the school district I left. And he told me when I dipped my toe in leadership, he said, never lose the heart of a teacher. And he wrote that in my goodbye letter that was, super emotional and sad to leave that wonderful place. But he said, you're going to make a great principal, but never lose the heart of a teacher. And if you never lose the heart of a teacher, you'll be just fine.
Wow. Love that. So we very clearly understand that the school year goes in different waves. There are, I think you mentioned earlier, honeymoon times that you would expect towards the beginning of the year, right? Last day of school, great day. We understand there are positives. There are also challenging times, like, parent teacher conferences is naturally always stressful, even with good relationships. End of report cards, frankly, winters are tough. What can you share with educators to help them power up through those moments of struggle?
I think that the biggest thing that I would say is that, you have to, when you have those moments that you're really discouraged and you're not quite sure, why did I choose this, why did I choose this profession? And, why did I, go down this path? I think the biggest thing that I would always say is that you need to find the good, right? You need to find the one victory that you can celebrate. So it could be the kid that is just every day really struggling with fluency or really struggling with comprehension or math or whatever it is. And then that one moment, that one kid for 5 seconds does the exact skill that you've been teaching for weeks and months, and they finally get it. Celebrate it. And remember that took a lot of effort and that took a lot of repetition, but you did that. And it's okay to own it and celebrate it and shout it to the trees and send out an email to your teachers and your colleagues so that they can celebrate it with you. Like, don't forget that you became an educator, the reason you became an educator, and find ways within your own room to celebrate that, and be okay with shouting it out and getting the feedback that you need, because that's what we need. We need to be reminded of the things we're doing well instead of being reminded of all the things that are going wrong, or at least the things that are perceived to be wrong. So keep focusing on the positive. And if what we focus on, we get more of. So if we're going to focus on the things that we're struggling with, then we'll get there. So biggest thing is, when you're starting to really doubt or get frustrated, focus on what you want and focus on that kid that you've been working really hard. And when they get there, celebrate it.
So it's easy to fall into facilitating a repetitive classroom. What do you think separates the teachers who are the ones constantly seeking to change, innovate, and apply new teaching strategies to their classroom?
I think what separates them is that I think it's their environment that they're working in. I think if they're in an environment that is supportive of new innovation and learning things and seeing a problem and trying to problem solve it, I think that separates them. So I feel like the biggest thing is being comfortable with learning and being comfortable and going to colleagues and really having a community where you can feel like you can be vulnerable and ask questions, say, I'm really struggling with this, or going to a conference and bringing back something and being encouraged to continue with it. Because sometimes people will go to conferences and then they won't necessarily like, they want to implement it, but it doesn't quite fit. And am I going to get support to do it? And so I think that those things are really important, is to make sure that you go to conferences and you seek out things. And if you're struggling with things in your classroom, don't be afraid to, research those things and come up with a solution. And I guarantee you, if you're in a school that likes those things, then you'll be fine. And if you're not, then let's find a place for you. That's what I would say, because there is a place someplace that will be okay with that. So it's okay. Like, you can get a new job, because teacher shortages is real. So.
We've talked to a few educators at this point and administrators that just said, if you can justify something awesome for kids, there's usually a way to find funds to make it happen. So I think that message is important to point out. And, a lot of times limitations are because you didn't ask. A lot of us are like, oh, we don't want to trouble. We don't want to rock the boat. Rock the boat. If you see something awesome, give it a shot. What's the harm if it only lasts, 2 months, as long as it didn't cost a ridiculous amount of money. But the last is, really a very simple one. How can we continue to kind of learn from you? What are best ways that our audience can continue to keep the conversation going or follow your journey through leading and just wisdom, whether that's social media or, website, anything that you do that they can then can keep connected?
So full disclosure, I'm not really into
Totally
social
fine.
media. I know I should be. So you guys might have
That's
to
okay.
take that part out of the interview, but like
No worries. No obligations.
so I would say, I definitely have social media, and I have Instagram, and Instagram is my my thing that I do when I just need to check out and do my scrolling with my animal videos. And so there's those things. But, I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter, but I don't really engage with it just because I've had histories with that aren't very positive. So after you delete that part, I would say that, people can just reach out to me. Like I'm really readily available. I do consult. I do help other schools when they need it. So people just honestly just email me, and I say yes, and then I go and help. I know that's not a great answer to your question, but that's literally what I do.
That's perfect.
Awesome. Is that do you want to share your email here?
Sure. It's I guess I'll just do my school district one. It's nbarney@anacondaschools.org.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
So Norah, no, it's absolutely fine. This has been a blast. I've loved this conversation, and it's very reaffirming to hear a leader that I think is very grounded in doing what's best for students. And your district is clearly very lucky to have someone in such a high position, fighting and advocating for what is best for students by supporting teachers. I think that's the best combination that we can ask for. So thank you for everything that you do for education. Thank you for everything that you do for students and for teachers as a whole. For our listeners, someone listening to this podcast for the first time, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this podcast. Please also consider leaving us a review on Apple or Spotify. It just helps us be found more in the education realm. And honestly, it's not, I've said before, it's not for the benefit of Matt and I, it's for the benefit of our guests and teachers so they can hear the amazing stories and advice and ideas that we have on this podcast week in and week out. This is our 100th show, and I'm just amazed and blown away and blessed and feel so fortunate to have the amazing guests like we had tonight with you, Norah. So thank you again for your time. And Matt, why don't you take us
as we power down the 100th episode, Norah? Without a doubt, you left us feeling powered up. So thank you for your time, everyone who's listening. Have a great week. Make it a special one, and we'll talk to you next one.